take a little bit more of my clean water, paint it right on top of the lighter parts, and drag some of that over so that my whole box has a little bit of blue or a whole lot of blue, depending on where we look. And do what we call wet on wet. And that can mean a couple of different things. We're going to try a couple different ways of using wet on wet. The first, we're going to take our nice clean paintbrush. If it's not clean, take a second, wash it right off. We're going to get it into that nice, totally clean water, crystal clear. Wow, we could drink it. And you're again going to paint on the empty box. Now this time we're going to paint about half of it. It can be a little more, it can be a little less, but we need space over here and we need some wet part over here. Now we got to work a little quick here, so I'm going to keep on painting. And as I do, I'm going to take some paint right on my paintbrush and I'm going to paint right on top of that wet paper. Now we see that it has a nice soft edge wherever I've made that paint. If I add a little bit more clean water onto it, just like with watercolor paints, I can make this very light and airy so that I can see right through it. So this is a great way to do some underpainting, to add some interesting layers to the paint that we're using, to fill whole spots really quickly. And we're going to, once we've got a nice amount of paint on there, I'm going to drop a couple drops of water right on there and see what happens. We can notice that the water itself will carry some of the paint around. That gives us a lot of different possibilities to have some fun, to have some creative freedom with our paint. And if we keep that up and we add a little bit of another paint right on top of that, those colors are going to blend together, they're going to mix together, and some real water on top, especially once it's already layered. We can do a lot of interesting things with wet on wet. The next, we wash our paintbrush out, uses first one layer of wet paint. I'm going to use some orange. Maybe for this one I'm going to paint a sphere. Now I'm going to start with a circle, but we know that a sphere is a form, a three-dimensional shape. And to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional, I'm going to make sure that I've got some nice wet paint on there, a good thick layer. And now I'm going to dip my brush into another paint. And notice when I do, I'm only touching the very edge so the whole thing doesn't get contaminated. I don't want all orange red. I just want a little bit of red right on the tip of my brush. And I'm going to make one side a little bit darker. And when I have wet red paint that I'm mixing right on top of wet orange paint, it lets me blend those colors in a really nice, free, fun sort of a way. Alright, that's looking like a pretty good shadow on my little sphere here. And if I want to, I can then take some yellow paint, and I'm going to make a highlight on here as well. It looks like it's a little bit bright at first, no problemo with wet on wet. I can blend it, soften it up, I can change the colors, I can blend them all together, whatever I want to do. Maybe I need a little bit more yellow on there right now. Oh, neato. Looks good. Super duper. Alright, gang. So wet on wet is a great way to blend your colors, to build things up, and to have lots of rich, realistic looking values in your color. For dry brush techniques, we want to get paint on one side of the brush and try to keep the other side as clean of paint as possible. And we're going to do that by dipping just onto the very edge of our paint palette. And if you look, you can see that I am just barely dipping the brush into the paint so that one side gets pretty loaded in paint and that the other side has only a little bit on there. And then I'm going to take that side that only has a tiny bit, and I'm going to brush that just a little bit onto a paper towel. So now I've got one side with no paint, almost no paint at all. One side has some extra paint on there. With this type of painting, we're going to keep our brush at a sharper angle, either a steep angle or a middle angle. I'm going to ask you to try both. And while you're trying them, you want to get only the very tip of your paintbrush to be touching the paper at first, and then see what happens if you push a little harder and get a little more, push a little harder and get a little more. And see the different kinds of textures, the different kinds of lines, the different effects that you're going to get. Dry brushing is really effective for getting some areas very painty, but having much more control over our brush. If you tilt it very straight, even almost upright, you can get a nice clean edge. If you tilt a little bit more to a middle angle, you will get this sort of nice textured paint style where some parts have color and some don't. You can experiment a little bit, add a little bit more paint on your brush if you want to. Just see what happens. Try a few different things. Make some different types of marks. Press a little bit harder and use more of the paint. Try a long stroke and see what happens. Notice that you get more paint at the beginning and barely any at there. Would this be a great way to make a comet? You bet it would. With dry brushing, we want to make sure that we always have the painty side of our brush facing up and the clean side of our brush facing the paper, facing downward. So we want to be able to look and see the lump of paint on top of our paintbrush. And that's going to give us this ability to have multiple layers, to have these interesting textures that come out from our paintbrush. For our next technique, we're going to scumble or use scumbling. With this technique, we want to hold our brush pretty much straight up and down. Doesn't really matter which kind of brush you use. In fact, you should try both your round-headed brush and your flat-headed brush, your square brush, and just see what happens. But with scumbling, we're going to hold our brush straight up and down. We're going to get paint just on the very tip of the brush on both sides this time. So that we have some paint all on this side, some on this side, but most of the bristle, all this space back here, has no paint at all. And we're just going to make some dots. We're going to start with very, very, very light dots. See the smallest dots of paint you can put on the page. And then start to press a little harder and a little harder and a little harder and a little harder and a little harder. And as we push a little bit harder, we see that more of the bristle touches the paper, and that means that more paint gets on the page. So try a bunch of different things. Try some tiny little dots. Let's try 10 tiny little dots, 10 or more medium-sized dots, and 10 or more big-sized dots. Oh wow, that looks neat. Now I'm going to mix in another color. Let's see what happens when we do that. As we add in other colors, we notice that some areas where there was extra paint, the two colors will blend. In some areas, one color will still show through. Other areas, the first color will still show through. This might remind you of scumbling, which we did with our oil pastels. As you're making your dots in a variety of sizes, little ones, big ones, pressing hard and soft, trying to experiment, show lots of different types of mark. I want to see a whole bunch of different types on your page. You can do it. You can even try mixing in a third color. I use blue and green so far, so I'm going to put some yellow on there. And all of a sudden, I'm going to start noticing that these colors are really starting to mix together. When they do, this kind of starts to look like maybe a tree, an autumn, or a bush. Looks like I got a little bit of orange from my yellow. That's okay. Art, sometimes we make mistakes and we just have to roll with them. For our next box, we're going to experiment with as many different pressures of mark making that we can. We're going to start with pressing our paintbrush on the page as lightly as possible, and then a little harder and a little harder and a little harder and a little harder and a little harder until the whole bristle is pressed on there. Now we're not going to slam it on, we're not going to smash our paintbrush onto the page like we hate it. We love our paintbrush, but we're going to give it some different pressure. So I'm going to start with just a very light touch at about a middle angle. And I want you to experiment, see what happens with almost no touching and a whole bunch of different types of marks. Try what happens when you have the paintbrush upright like I just did. What about if you have the paintbrush at a very shallow angle? What happens with the different types of marks that you can get? What kinds of marks happen when we try different pressures? Try a lot, try a whole bunch of them. And that one came out pretty well, so I can dip back in, and I'm going to try to make another set of lines inside there. I kind of fuzzed up the edge a little bit, made it look like kind of a bad hair day. I just thought that was fun. You don't have to. Let's get some nice sharp lines, clean edge lines before you do any kind of fun, funky stuff like that. As you see, we're going to keep on just making these shapes, putting them inside of each other, getting clean, smooth edges. For our next box, we're going to try to get a bunch of very clean, sharp lines. We're going to try and draw a complex shape that we can have smooth, clean edges for. Now, just like when we were doing dry brush, we're going to try to have paint only on one side of our brush. So I've got some good paint on the top here. I've got some paint on the back, so I'm just going to wipe that off. Now, I've still got paint on one side. The other side is all clean. Now, I'm going to try and draw a shape as carefully as I can to have the thin, skinny little line. And I want to see 10 or 15 very skinny lines that you can make. See as thin as you can make them. Once you've got those skinny little lines, try to connect a bunch of those lines to make some kind of a shape. The more complex, the better. If we can make, let's say, a cool graffiti arrow right now. Now, this is an interesting shape to make because not only does it have straight edges, it has some curves in it too, and we have to figure out how to make that work. Notice that I am having my brush at a shallow angle or a middle angle. I'm trying only to touch with the very tip of the brush, so I'm trying to press a very light pressure. So I think inside of that, I'm going to do the same shape, but with some orange paint. Let's see how that works. Let's see how skinny I can make a shape. All right, that's coming out pretty good. Messed up right there. That's okay. This is practice. Now I want to try and keep an even, consistent line wherever possible. For the last box of this practice, we're going to do some reduction. So we're going to practice a couple of these techniques that we've already had, and then just like when we did sgraffito with our oil pastels, we're going to scratch some away and see what happens when we work in the reductive, when we reduce the amount of paint on the page. To do that though, first we have to have some paint to remove, so let's get going. I can use my bigger brush here, and I'm just going to cover the whole page. Oh, that looks pretty good. Maybe I'm gonna get it nice and thick right on there, and then I'm going to, let's add some blue into some spots. That looks pretty cool. What happens if I add a little bit of red and blend? What about some white? Can I blend some white in there? Of course I can. Maybe I'll add a couple of dots of... Unfortunately, I had an unexpected delay there, so my painting dried up a little bit more than I had hoped it would, but we're still going to see what happens with reduction. So with reduction, just like sgraffito, we're going to scratch some of that paint off, and let's see. That's still working fine. So this is another one of those times where having some underpainting is going to do us right. Alright, neato, gang. Looks like I can scratch a bunch of different textures in there. Maybe I make it a line drawing of a bird, and he's going to be saying Bach. Can't write Bach, that's okay.